This is part 2 of my response to Dan McClellan's recent video about me. So then we get to the supposed discrepancies between Luke and Paul, and I'm thankful that Dan actually graced us with some examples here, though saddened that he didn't actually explain how these matters conflict or why we should think that there is an issue. He says that the letters of Paul conflict with Acts on matters of Paul's conversion or his various visits to Jerusalem. Okay, how? How do they conflict? Where's the issue? Dan throws out claims of conflict, but he doesn't elaborate. The only one of these he actually provided some form of explanation or elaboration on was regarding James's quotation of a section of the Old Testament that we find in Acts 15. His citation of this verse as a problem is laughable, and so I want to turn my attention to it now. In Acts 15, James gets up and provides a speech to the audience in which he quotes a passage from Amos 9. The objection raised by Dan is that James mistranslates the verse quoted as it appears in the Septuagint, and that James would not have been quoting from the Septuagint in the first place. And if you don't know what that is, the Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. So let's look at the claim that James would not be quoting from a Greek translation of the Old Testament. Keener objects to this suggestion by noting several things. One, it would be disrespectful to the diaspora delegates whose future the discussions concerned not to use the language that they would understand. Two, even later rabbinic sources in Hebrew or Aramaic draw on whatever versions, including the Septuagint, serve best their point. 3. Public life in Jerusalem included Greek as well as Aramaic, and even many residents of Lower Galilee were partially bilingual. 4. For what it's worth, the early letter, widely circulated in James's name, displays a higher level of Greek than here, fitting its diaspora audience. Now, if Dan wants to make an argument that James would not quote the Greek to contest the points I just made, I'm open to hearing it. Next is the assertion that James mistranslates the Greek translation here, and that this somehow shows an error on Luke's part. This is just silly, and it's important to note that the Greek and the Hebrew text of Amos 9, which is the verse James is quoting, they differ at certain points. So when James quotes Amos 9 in Acts 15, it's not quoted exactly as we find it in the Greek or in the Hebrew translations, and it seems like the Greek is the primary text being quoted, but that there are some changes that indicate that the Hebrew is also being used, or that even several passages are being conflated together. So one might reasonably ask, what's going on here? Why is James mixing and matching the Greek with sections from Hebrew, or why are these other kind of prophetic passages thrown in? Like, what's happening? So the short explanation of this is that James sees in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus the fulfillment of Amos 9. But James is thinking about this in an abstract and theological way. When he cites this verse in his speech, he is in a sense doing theology on the fly. He is mixing and matching in a way that makes his theological point the clearest to his audience, while still remaining faithful to the original text. And in doing this, he is engaging in culturally appropriate hermeneutic practice. Mixed citations were common among those who worked with both languages. To summarize this section, it's just asinine and blatantly hostile to accuse the text of error here just because the Apostle James is what he's quoting doesn't precisely line up with the Greek translation. James is engaging in hermeneutical practices that were normal in his time. And now, this is a pretty technical topic, and I've only kind of just given a brief run through of it. If you want to know more, I suggest checking out Renko Stefanovic's paper, James's use of Amos 9 and in Acts 15 in the current debate, or W.E. Glennie's paper, The Septuagint and Apostolic Hermeneutics, Amos 9 in Acts 15. Now, Dan asserts that explanations are merely apologetic attempts to gin up little slivers, but this is just childish insult. If you assert that a text displays an error or contradiction, and then somebody points out details of the text that indicates it isn't, your response has to be more than these type of one-liners for you to maintain any resemblance of credibility. One could just as easily point that finger back at the overly skeptical critical scholar and say they were just trying to gin up any resemblance of an error. At the core of Dan's comment on this, he's just psychoanalyzing me and not engaging with the topic at hand. Dan then goes on to try and show an error in Luke using Luke 2:1, which references a census being applied to the whole world, arguing that this would be detrimental to the whole economy of Rome and that it's unhistorical and so on. And a major problem here is that Dan is assuming that the whole world being referred to in Luke 2:1 is in reference to the entire Roman Empire. It's worth noting that the word that is translated for world here means land, and we see Luke use this same word in Acts 11:28 specifically to refer to the whole land of Judea. So when Luke says the whole world or the whole land had to be registered, we might ask ourselves why we should assume he is referring to the whole Roman Empire and not merely literally all of Judea, especially when we see Luke use this term elsewhere in a more restricted sense. And it's possible that this use of the word is referring to the whole Roman Empire, right? I can't rule that out, but as Dan knows, one has to do more than gin up little mere slivers of possibilities, right? Now let's look at Luke 2:2, which is in reference to Quirinius performing a census. The supposed issue here is that Quirinius' famous census, which started a series of civil unrest, was conducted around 6 AD, which is when he was appointed as the legate ruler of Syria. This information comes from Josephus, and Josephus makes no mention of a previous census by Quirinius before this. However, this was roughly a decade after Jesus was born, yet Luke seems to be speaking of the census as if it was contemporary with the birth of Jesus. And the argument here is that Luke, therefore, doesn't know what he's talking about. Now, before we get started here, I think it's important to note two things. First, let's recognize that Luke displays that he knew that Jesus was born in the reign of Herod in Luke 1:5. And in Acts 5:27, Luke also displays he was aware of the census of Quirinius taking place in AD 6. The internal data from Luke's writing indicates that he knew about the Quirinius census in AD 6 that Josephus refers to. Second, Luke is a historical source that gives us information about his time just as much as Josephus is, though Luke is closer to the events that happened than Josephus is. So I say this because I want to point out that to say that Luke contradicts Josephus, therefore Luke is wrong, would be just as misguided as saying Josephus contradicts Luke, therefore Josephus is wrong. It's my position that a responsible and charitable historian will look at both the information from Josephus and the history from Luke, recognize that both of these men display great historical skill, and see if there's an answer to the supposed contradiction. And I think there are two suggestions that can be said here. The first and most simple response is to recognize that the word used for first in this passage, which is protos, is usually in reference to chronological priority. So the idea here is that out of all of the censuses that have been done, this one came first. However, as many scholars have noted and argued, the word used here can also mean before. So scholars like Nigel Turner and N.T. Wright think this verse is more accurately translated as something like, this census was before the census taken when Quirinius was governor. N.T. Wright suggests this in his book Luke for Everyone, and Nigel Turner puts forth this view in his book Grammatical Insights into the New Testament. There are a number of highly knowledgeable and respectable scholars who have argued for this position and done so based on the grammar displayed in Luke 2:2. If this is so, it's a pretty straightforward explanation that makes sense of all the data. Another explanation is that Luke 2:2 indicates that Quirinius oversaw a census prior to his more famous one in AD 6. Gleason Archer argues this in his Encyclopedia of Bible Difficulties, and it would mean that Quirinius served as a type of ruler before him being officially appointed, which is not unheard of. Keener also floats this idea in his IVB Bible Background Commentary. Regardless, unless one approaches this verse with an explicit intent to gin up the impossibility of Luke being accurate, it's not problematic. As for linguistic differences in the early chapters of Luke, Dan makes an assertion without giving an elaboration or citing from any scholarly sources, which is what I have come to expect of him. So until he does that, I really don't see much to address here. And in fact, I think I'm actually going to end my response here, though I planned on addressing everything he said, because frankly, I'm tired of wasting my time. In my video responses, I've supported my positions by citing relevant scholars and elaborating on the topics at hand. Dan, on the other hand, except for one mention of Bauckham in his last video, has not referenced or cited any scholars. He hides behind these empty slogans about the consensus of critical scholarship, yet he provides no evidence that the consensus of critical scholarship actually supports his position. And then when he is challenged with evidence that the consensus actually doesn't support his position, his response is to just hand wave everybody else and call them dishonest idiots who aren't engaged in quality scholarship. Dan has an opportunity to use his platform to display to the non-academic world what proper academic conduct looks like, yet he squanders that opportunity by being insulting and disingenuous to others in his field, and he never actually supports his claim with any academic evidence. This will be my last response in our dialogue, as I think Dan's behavior and refusal to support his claims with cited sources have made clear this will not be a productive exchange. I trust that those who look at our exchange with an open mind will be able to see which one of us has engaged in a manner befitting that of a scholar, and which one of us has engaged in a manner befitting a schoolyard bully.